At 6:48 on a Tuesday morning in late October, Reed Callister decided that the highway between Mississauga and downtown Toronto had a personal grudge against him specifically. He had left the house at 6. He had calculated the drive at 32 minutes. He had not calculated the transport truck that had decided to redistribute its load across 2 lanes near the 427 or the subsequent chain of brake lights that stretched back far enough to make a man question every decision that had brought him to this particular overpass at this particular moment in his life. Reed turned off the podcast he had not been listening to anyway, and sat with the silence. The acquisition of Northgate Logistics had been finalized 11 days ago. His legal team had spent 8 months on the deal. His CFO had called it surgical. His board had called it visionary. Reed had called it done and moved on to the next problem, which was what you did when you were the kind of person who treated problems like inbox items. The next problem was the Northgate workforce. 2,043 employees across 6 facilities. His operations director had sent a preliminary culture assessment that Reed had read on a plane between Calgary and Ottawa and then set down without finishing, which was unusual for him. He read everything. He finished everything. He had set it down because the language in the report kept using phrases like ambient fear and voluntary turnover masking involuntary pressure, and something about reading those phrases at 30,000 feet had made him feel the altitude differently. Traffic moved. Reed moved with it. He stopped at a gas station just off Dundas because the low fuel light had been on since Oakville, and he had been ignoring it the way he ignored most things that weren't immediately urgent. He filled the tank, went inside for coffee, and found himself behind a woman who was conducting what appeared to be a full negotiation with a self-serve machine that had jammed mid-pour. She was maybe early 30s. Dark hair pulled back in a way that suggested it had started neater than it currently was. She wore the kind of lanyard that meant she was someone who spent her days being responsible for other people. And she was pressing the side of the machine with the flat of her palm, the way people pressed elevator buttons when they were already late. The machine yielded nothing. She exhaled through her nose. Reed watched her check the time on her phone, then check the machine again, then look at the cashier counter where the line was 4 people deep. He watched her run a quick calculation behind her eyes, the kind of math that had nothing to do with numbers and everything to do with whether one more inconvenience was the one she could absorb. He recognized that math. He had watched it on his own face in hotel mirrors more times than he could count, though his inconveniences had always come with considerably more cushion. He stepped forward. He pressed the reset button on the side panel, the one that wasn't labeled, the one the attendant had shown him 6 months ago during a different delay on a different bad morning, and the machine hummed and resumed and dispensed a medium-dark roast into her waiting cup. She turned and looked at him with the specific expression of someone recalibrating. "Thank you," she said. "I was about to have a conversation with that machine that neither of us would recover from." Reed almost smiled. "They have a weakness on the left side." "How do you know that?" "I have been defeated by this exact machine before." She nodded once slowly. The way people nodded when they were genuinely tired and small pieces of information landed differently than they should. She picked up her coffee and moved to add cream, and Reed filled his own cup, and they ended up standing beside each other at the condiment counter in the way of strangers who have no particular reason to keep talking but haven't yet stopped. Her lanyard read Hamilton General Physiotherapy Services. Below that, a photo ID. Below that, a name, Petra Anand RT Respiratory Therapy. Reed noticed the R beneath the photo and corrected himself silently. Not physiotherapy, respiratory. She noticed him noticing. "I'm cross-credentialed," she said without any particular warmth. "People always look at the lanyard trying to figure out where I belong. I wasn't trying to figure out where you belong." She looked at him then, directly, the way people looked at you when they'd had enough of being managed. "Then what were you doing?" "Reading," he said, professionally. "It's a habit that occasionally crosses into rudeness." A pause. "Fair enough," she said. She snapped the lid onto her cup. She was turning to leave when the man behind the counter called out. "Card machine's down," he said. "Cash only for the next few minutes." She stopped, looked at her phone, because most people kept Apple Pay and not actual currency, and her expression told Reed everything he needed to know about how much cash she was carrying. He paid for both coffees without making a production of it. She turned back. "You didn't have to do that. I know. The machine owes you one." She studied him for a moment. Then, "I'm not going to argue with a stranger in a gas station at 7 in the morning. That seems wise. She left. Reed stood for a moment with his coffee in the quiet of a transaction that had cost him $4 and taken approximately 90 seconds and felt, for reasons he couldn't immediately categorize, more honest than anything he had done in the past 11 days. He drove the rest of the way to Toronto without the podcast. Northgate Logistics had its administrative offices on the 12th floor of a building on Bay Street that smelled like carpet cleaner and controlled anxiety. Reed arrived at 8:47, which was later than he'd planned and earlier than anyone expected, which was how he preferred arrivals. His operations director, Stuart Briggs, met him in the lobby with the expression of a man who had been given insufficient notice of an inspection. Briggs was efficient and capable, and had worked at Northgate for 9 years, and he spoke in the smooth rehearsed cadence of someone who had learned that people in positions of authority preferred presentations to conversations. "We have the floor tour ready," Briggs said. "Leadership team is assembled in the main boardroom at 10. I've prepared an overview of Q3 targets and the integration timeline." Reed said he'd like to walk the floor first. Without the tour, Briggs's smile remained technically intact. The floor was the kind of space that told you things the reports didn't. Reed walked it slowly. He watched who stopped talking when a manager walked by. He watched where people kept their personal items, close to their bodies, not spread out, which meant they didn't feel settled. He watched a woman type an email and then pause, and then delete what she'd written and start again. And something about the geometry of her hesitation stayed with him. He stopped at the break room. There was a whiteboard on the wall with a motivational quote written in marker. "Results are the only language leadership speaks." Below it, in smaller writing that someone had added in a different color, "What about the people producing the results?" No question mark. Reed photographed it. He found the HR office. The administrator, a tired-looking man named Gerard Finch, explained the complaint process with the specific flatness of someone who had explained it many times without it having changed anything. Reed asked how many formal complaints had been filed in the past 18 months. Finch said 11. Reed asked how many had been resolved in favor of the employee. Finch said 2. Reed asked what happened to the other 9. Finch looked at his desk. He said they had been reviewed and closed at the discretion of the regional manager. Reed asked who the regional manager was. The answer was Dale Mercer. Dale Mercer was the kind of man who had learned that confidence at volume was frequently mistaken for competence. He had been at Northgate for 14 years. He had delivered consistent numbers. He had done this, Reed would come to understand, the way some people always delivered consistent numbers, by making the cost invisible, by distributing it quietly among the people least positioned to complain. Reed observed the 10 o'clock meeting from a chair at the side of the room. Mercer presented the Q3 results with the satisfaction of a man presenting his own portrait. Revenue up 11%, turnaround times improved. Staff utilization, a phrase Reed noted mentally, at 94%. Then he introduced a logistics coordinator named Petra Anand and asked her to walk the room through the new routing software her team had implemented. Reed looked up. She stood at the front of the room with a laptop and a composure that was doing a great deal of work. She was wearing the same lanyard as this morning, minus the hospital ID, and she spoke about the routing system with the specific fluency of someone who had built it and knew every corner of it. When she finished, Mercer said, "Great summary," and began talking about next quarter before she had fully returned to her seat. He did not say her name again. 3 of the 4 slides she had presented were credited on their footers to the regional operations team. Reed watched her sit down. He watched her open her notebook and write something. He watched her not look at Mercer. After the meeting, he stayed in the room. Petra was the last to leave. She nearly walked into him near the door. Her face did the recalibrating thing again, faster this time. "You're the buyer," she said. "Not a question." Reed said yes. She looked at him for a moment, at his suit, at the notepad he was holding, at the fact that he was standing in the doorway of a room where she'd just spent 40 minutes being made invisible. "Did you enjoy the presentation?" she said. "I thought it was the most technically fluent thing in that room." She said nothing, but something in her shoulders changed. He asked if she had a few minutes. She said she had a meeting at 11. He asked if it was with Mercer. She paused. Yes. He asked if she wanted to cancel it. She looked at him the way people looked at trapeze bars, with the understanding that letting go was the point, and also the terrifying part. She said, "That depends on what you're offering instead." Reed said he wanted to hear about the routing system from the person who actually built it. Petra was quiet for 3 seconds. Then she said, "It wasn't just me." "I know," Reed said. "I'd like to hear about them too." She told him about the routing system over bad coffee in the fourth-floor conference room. She told him about the 18 months her team had spent building and testing it, about the 3 iteration cycles, about the night they'd run a live pilot on the Kitchener route and stayed until 1 in the morning eating vending machine sandwiches and watching the data come in. She told him about the time she had written a proposal to expand the system to the Montreal corridor, and Mercer had presented the proposal to the VP of Operations as his own idea, with 1 paragraph reworded and her name removed from the header. She said this the way people said things they had rehearsed stopping themselves from saying for so long that when they finally said it, it came out too flat, like all the heat had been burned off waiting. Reed wrote it down, she noticed. "Are you actually writing that down?" she said. "Yes." "Why?" "Because it's the part that matters." She looked at him across the table. She had a coffee cup she kept turning in both hands without drinking from it. "You paid for my coffee this morning," she said. Reed said yes. She said, "I didn't know who you were." "I know. Does that change anything?" He said. "It tells me something about how you behave when there's nothing to gain from it." She looked uncomfortable with that. He understood being witnessed by someone with power over your situation was not the same as being seen, and she was smart enough to know the difference. "I'm not interested in being a story," she said. "The kind companies tell about themselves after they've done something bad and want to feel better about it." Reed said, "I'm not here to feel better about anything." She studied him again. Then she said, "There are 11 people on my team. Most of them have been here longer than Mercer has. Most of them stopped filing complaints 2 years ago because the process led nowhere, and Mercer had a way of making the year after a complaint harder than the year before." Reed said, "I'd like to talk to them." Petra said, "Not going to trust you." "I know. They've been here before. Someone from above comes and listens and then nothing changes." Reed said, "I understand that. I'd like to try anyway." She set down the coffee cup. Then she said, "My team takes lunch at 12:30 in the East break room. If you want to meet people who have no reason to trust you, and every reason to be watching their backs, that's where they'll be." She left without waiting for a response. Reed looked at the notepad in front of him. He had written 3 pages. He met the team at 12:30. There was a woman named Cynthia who had been at Northgate for 11 years and spoke in complete sentences that landed like documents. There was a young man named Theon Kemdirim, who had started 18 months ago, and who was clearly still deciding whether his instincts about this place were correct or too cynical. There was a woman named Frances who said almost nothing until the last 10 minutes, and then said 3 things that reorganized the entire conversation. There was distrust, and there was exhaustion, and there was the particular weariness of people who had made peace with things they should not have had to make peace with. Reed asked questions. He wrote down answers. He did not make promises. Theo asked him directly, "What happens to Mercer?" Reed said, "I'm still gathering information." "That's not an answer." Reed said, "No, it isn't. I'll have one for you by end of week." Cynthia looked at Petra. Petra was looking at Reed. Frances said, "End of week was a long time ago, the first time someone said it." Reed said, "I know." He left the break room. In the elevator, he thought about the whiteboard. What about the people producing the results? He thought about the complaint reports closed without resolution. He thought about the routing software whose footer read Regional Operations Team, instead of the names of 11 people who had worked on it for 18 months. He thought about the way Petra had said, "I'm not interested in being a story," with the precision of someone who had been made into one before. He called his legal director from the parking garage. He asked how quickly a regional manager's employment could be terminated for cause, given documented evidence of complaint suppression, intellectual property misattribution, and systematic retaliation. His legal director said, "With what you've described, quickly." He asked if Reed wanted to wait for the formal integration review. Reed said no. He called Stuart Briggs next and told him to assemble the Northgate leadership team for Friday morning. He said he would be presenting findings. Briggs asked which findings. Reed said, "The ones that matter." Then he sat in the parking garage for a moment with his phone in his hand and thought about the gas station, the machine with the weakness on the left side. The woman who had said, "I'm not going to argue with a stranger in a gas station at 7 in the morning," like it was a policy she had developed for good reasons. He drove back to Mississauga. Friday arrived the way Fridays arrived when something was about to change. like the last hour of a shift when everyone could feel the clock. Petra came in early. Reed knew because he had arrived at 7:40 and she was already at her desk, a coffee from home in a thermos, headphones on, not listening to them. He had not spoken to her since Tuesday. She had not contacted him, which he respected, and also felt, which surprised him. The 10 o'clock meeting filled the boardroom the way all-hands meetings filled rooms, with the combination of dread and curiosity that came from being told so. Something was happening without being told what. Mercer sat near the screen. He had his tablet and his numbers and the quiet confidence of a man who believed Friday mornings were for review, not reckoning. Reed began. He did not use the word culture or synergy or transformation. He used the words that were in the complaint files and the routing software footers, and the performance reviews that had been subtly adjusted in the months following formal grievances. The slide showing the complaint statistics went up first: 11 filed, 2 resolved, 9 closed at regional discretion. Mercer said the numbers lacked context. Reed said, "I've spent 3 days gathering context." The slide showing the routing software history went up second. The original proposal document, with Petra's name on the header, dated 14 months ago. The VP presentation, with that name removed, dated 13 months ago. The room was very quiet. Mercer said the proposal had been a collaborative document. An attribution had been a miscommunication at the presentation stage. Reed said, "I spoke to every member of the team who built it." Mercer's voice shifted into the register that people shifted into when they were no longer managing the room and were instead managing themselves. He said the acquisition had created instability. He said some employees had struggled to adapt. He said Reed was reacting to a handful of complaints from people who had performance concerns of their own. He did not look at Petra when he said it. He didn't have to. Everyone else did. Petra looked at the table. Her hands were flat on its surface. "Very still," Reed said. "Dale Mercer's employment with Northgate Logistics is terminated, effective today, for cause. The specific grounds will be documented in his separation file." The sentence sat in the room. Mercer tried once more. He said Reed was making a decision on incomplete information, driven by a personal relationship with an employee that had compromised his objectivity. Reed said, "I paid for a cup of coffee. I did so before I set foot in this building. The decision in front of you has nothing to do with that coffee and everything to do with what's in this file." He placed the complaint folder on the table. Then he looked at the room. He said, "The harder question isn't Dale Mercer. The harder question is how a manager behaving this way was retained and evaluated positively for 7 years. That question belongs to this company, and to me, because we acquired it without asking it first." The room didn't move. Stuart Briggs looked at his hands. Cynthia, seated near the wall, was looking at something just past the window. Theo was looking directly at Reed with an expression that hadn't decided what it was yet. Frances was crying, quietly, in a way that suggested she'd been holding it for longer than this meeting. After, people moved around each other carefully, the way people moved in spaces that had just rearranged their known geography. Petra found Reed near the printer station on the 4th floor, which was running a job that appeared to have no intention of completing. She stood a few feet away and said, "The printer is an allegory." Reed said, "For what?" She said, "Systems that keep running processes that stopped working a long time ago." He almost smiled. She said, "I want to be clear about something." He waited. She said, "What happened in there? I'm grateful for it. But I need you to understand that for the past 14 months, I showed up to a job that was making me smaller every day, because I couldn't afford to leave. My mother had a hip replacement in February. The Northgate benefits were covering her physiotherapy. I sat quiet through things I should have shouted about because losing this job meant something specific and concrete, and it wasn't about me. Do you understand that?" Reed said yes. She said, "I'm not sure you do, actually, not the way I do. But I believe you're trying to," he said. "That's more than I deserve at the moment." She looked at him. Then she said, "You wrote down what I said about the proposal." "I did. You didn't have to," Reed said. "I know that's what makes it matter instead of procedure." A pause. She said, "That's almost exactly what I said to you at the gas station," he said. "I know." She turned and looked at the printer, which had just produced a single blank page, and stopped again. Then she said, "There's going to be a transition period, there is, and you'll need someone who knows how the routing system actually works," he said. "I was hoping to discuss that," she said. "I'm not interested in a symbolic title and a raise that's meant to make me feel like the story ended well." Reed said, "I'm not offering that." She said, "Then what are you offering?" He said, "A real role. Operational authority over system integration across all 6 facilities. Your name on the work. Direct reporting line to me. Petra was quiet, then, and the team. Reed said, same terms for anyone who wants them. Documented contribution. Review process that doesn't run through a single regional manager. She nodded once slowly. She said, I'll think about it. He said, that's all I'm asking. She started walking away. Then she stopped. She said, you still owe the machine a coffee. He said, I'll set up a direct payment. She laughed, once, unexpectedly, the kind of laugh that came out before a person had decided to let it, and Reed filed that sound away in the part of himself that had been paying attention to things other than quarterly integration timelines. The weeks that followed were not clean. They never were. Reed had been in enough acquisitions to know that removing one bad actor was not the same as fixing the weather that had grown him. Northgate had systems that rewarded speed without asking what speed cost. It had performance metrics that measured output with no field for how it was extracted. It had a complaint process that worked exactly as it had been designed to work, which was to say, it absorbed grievances without acting on them. Broken process. It is a functioning one aimed at the wrong thing. Reed's HR director flew in from Vancouver. Her name was Miriam Ott, and she had the patient, deliberate manner of someone who had cleaned up after enough corporate messes to have opinions about the furniture. She reviewed the 9 closed complaints. She reopened 7 of them. She spent 2 days in one-on-ones with the people who had filed them, and on the 3rd day she came to Reed's temporary office with a summary document and set it on his desk and said, you should read this before you decide anything else. He read it. It took 40 minutes. He read it without setting it down. When he looked up, he said, how many of these people are still here? Miriam said. 6, he said. And the others? She said, left. 2 within the past year, 1 last month. He said, do we know where? Miriam said, one's at a competitor in Brampton, one's freelancing. The last one, and here she paused in a way that meant something. The last one left the industry. Reed sat with that. He thought about the whiteboard. What about the people producing the results? He thought about Francis crying at a table in a boardroom at 10 in the morning. He thought about Theo and Kemdirim sitting across from him in the break room, with the expression of someone deciding whether his instincts were correct or too cynical. He thought about the routing software, running on servers it had optimized, carrying loads across routes it had learned, under a name that wasn't the people who built it. He drafted a communication to the 6 remaining employees who had filed complaints. It was not a legal document. It was not from HR. He wrote it himself, 3 drafts, and in the final version he named what had happened, without softening it, and said the company had failed them in specific and documented ways, and that he was sorry, and that sorry was the beginning of something, not the end of it. Miriam read it and said, this is going to make legal uncomfortable. He said, I know, she said. It's the right thing to do. He said, yes. She nodded and took the document. He thought about his legal director's discomfort and decided it was appropriately placed. Petra accepted the role. She sent her answer in an email that was 3 sentences long. Yes to the position. Yes to the terms. The printer on 4 still needs replacing. Reed forwarded the email to Building Services and copied her on it. She replied with 1 word, efficient. He found himself reading that word longer than 1 word warranted. The routing system expansion went to the Montreal corridor in November. Petra led the implementation with Theo and a woman named Grace Okwu, who had been on the team from the beginning, and who turned out, once she had reason to speak in meetings without watching the clock, to have the kind of systems mind that reorganized conversations just by being in them. Reed attended 2 of the working sessions. He sat in the corner and did not run them, which was harder than running them. He was used to being the organizing principle of rooms. He was learning to be a different kind of presence in them. At the end of the 2nd session, Grace looked at him across the table and said, you're not what I expected. He said, what did you expect? She said, someone who'd come in, remove the obvious problem, and call it fixed. He said, we're not close to fixed. She said, no, but you know that. Which is different. On a Thursday in late November, Reed drove back through Mississauga in the early morning and stopped at the same gas station on Dundas. The machine worked without incident. He ordered 2 coffees without thinking about it, and then stood there holding them both, which was how Petra found him when she came in behind him. She had a physio appointment nearby and had stopped for the same reason he had, which was habit and cold weather and the particular mercy of caffeine before 8. She looked at the 2 cups. She said, who's the second one for? He said, I wasn't planning that far ahead. She said, "That's not like you." He said, "I'm trying new things." She took the second cup. They stood at the condiment counter in the way of people who had found each other at a gas station once before, and were trying to decide if this was a pattern or a coincidence, or something they were allowed to call something else. Petra said, "The Montreal numbers came in." Reed said, "I saw," she said. "Grace is going to want to propose the Calgary route next." He said, "I know, I'm already expecting the email," she said. "She copies you on everything now." She said, "I know. I find I don't mind." Petra added cream to her coffee and snapped the lid on. Outside, the parking lot held the flat gray light of November in Ontario, which was not beautiful in any obvious way but was honest about what it was. She said, "I told my mother about the job." He said, "What did she think?" Petra said, "She said if a company finally put my name on my work, she wanted to know who was responsible so she could write them a letter." Reed said, "I'd welcome that letter." She said, "She writes long ones. She's retired. She has opinions about paragraph structure." He said, "I have a good attention span." Petra looked at him. Then she looked at the window, at the gray November parking lot, at the slow traffic on Dundas beginning its morning argument with itself. She said, "I'm not easy to know." He said, "I'm aware of that," she said. "And you're used to being the most important thing in a room, which is going to be a recurring problem," he said. "I'm working on it." She said, "I know, I've been watching." A pause. She said, "I'm not promising anything," he said. "I'm not asking for a promise. I'm asking for coffee." She looked at him again directly, the way she had looked at him that first morning over a jammed machine recalibrating, and then she said, "Okay, coffee." They sat by the window. Outside, Toronto moved through its Tuesday with no interest in either of them, which was exactly right. Reed held his cup and did not think about Q4 projections, or the Calgary corridor, or the board call at 2 o'clock. He thought about the whiteboard on the 12th floor that now read, in Grace's handwriting under the old quote, "Results include the people who make them." He thought about Petra's name in the footer of the routing proposal, placed there now in the archived version that Miriam Ott had ensured was entered into the formal record. He thought about the gas station machine on a dark October morning, and a stranger who had not needed saving, had not asked to be saved, and had built something remarkable anyway, in the margins of a job that had spent 14 months trying to make that impossible. He thought that maybe the most useful thing he had done in the acquisition of Northgate Logistics was press a reset button on the left side of a coffee machine that nobody had labeled. And maybe what came after, the real work, the long work, the kind that didn't resolve in a quarterly report, had started not when the deal closed, but when Petra Anand picked up a cup with both hands, looked at him without knowing who he was, and decided he was worth a civil word anyway. He wasn't going to turn that into a story. He was going to try to deserve it.